So, hello. This evening we start our conversation dedicated to the one another postmodern author. This conversation will lead with one of the maybe most prominent literary theoretical, can we say it so? Also the professor of Department of English in the University of Illinois in Chicago, the author of the Geddes biography. It's called Nobody Grew But the Business, on the life and work of William Geddes, Joseph Теббі, and also Максимом Нестлєєвим, who is a translator of our theorist postmodern literature that we publish in publishing house Tempora. And I will start with a question to Joseph Теббі about Pynchon, because tomorrow we have lecture dedicated to Pynchon's work, reading Pynchon's texts. And I would like to ask you about the reason of Pynchon's popularity in postmodern culture and in USA, because a lot of authors like Geddes, McElroy and even Coover are not so popular and so widely known as Pynchon is. But Pynchon is rather complicated for reading, he's difficult for reading, sometimes we even suffer while reading Pynchon. So why is he so popular? Why? What is the secret of his poetics?
One thing that can't be neglected in answering that question is Pynchon's choice early in his career not to present himself in public. I don't think that's the main reason, but when it comes to popularity, which means having many people take an interest, that's an automatic interest that the author's not there. The author's not there in any photographs. Well, maybe there's one, I think, graduation photograph from high school. And that gives a kind of aura. And Pynchon thought this through early on, and that he thought this through in the same way that he thought through his aesthetic. It's a part of it. So the absence of the individual is kind of, you know,
advertising strategy.
Yeah, and it's an ironic one, but it's an effective one. Yeah.
What do you think?
I like a Salinger one. Yeah, that guys know how to have their people, have their readers, and I think he is one of the greatest author in the US nowadays. I mean, Pynchon, and he deserves a lot of attention, and he writes about everything. His novels, for example, Gravity's Raymond, is a novel not about VAO2 and so on and so forth. It's a novel about everything, about people, about countries, about war, about peace, and so on and so forth. And I want to ask Joseph Теббі, what do you think about this Pynchonian mix of irony, paranoia, and sincerity, which is, as for me, is very important for postmodern literature? What do you think of it?
The first thing I would say about these qualities is that they're no longer so popular. In fact, they're very much under attack. And the attack, I'll give one example from David Foster Wallace, who inspired and encouraged the valuation of sincerity rather than the overvaluation of postmodern irony, for example. Yeah. And who tried to find ways of knowing that didn't involve paranoia. The first thing I'd say is that stance, there was actually a name for it for a few years in the 90s, the new sincerity.
Yeah, I heard of it.
Yeah, and many authors kind of fell under this camp, fell within this camp, and used it as a way to disparage the kind of postmodern predecessors. It was also a return to a realism and a return to the self. You know, the same self that Pynchon, you know, like as a foundational move kept out of the picture. The new sincerity was bringing the self back in a way that you could appreciate, and you felt that the author was speaking to you. You felt that the author had a contract with you, an implicit contract that the author would entertain, and the reader would, you know, get value for the time spent. And now, so that's what I'd say about those three. I want to say I want to speak in defense of them momentarily, of paranoia and irony and postmodernism. But first I want to, you know, recognize that, you know, there was a concerted displacement of these things.
So can we say that, it may sound like a word, but can we say that the most popular postmodern authors are the less postmodern, in fact, because they just come back to this reality? And if so, what will be the next step of this return into reality?
The next step of literature, or the book itself, is very much in question. That's the first. That's the first answer to that. In doubt, to that good question. It's what we do see is a return to the realist tradition, but it's a realist tradition based on the self. Based on the identity, and based on the expression of the self, of internal qualities that one can believe in, the new sincerity. This is, in my view, putting aside all of the most interesting developments in Pynchon, DeLillo, McElroy, Gaddis, the authors that I wrote about in Postmodern Sublime. It doesn't engage all of the regions of thought that are outside the self, that call the readers outside of themselves, so that the reader's not thinking about the contract you have with the author in order to be entertained, but the reader is thinking about the whole network of information that influences who we are. And it's not only information, also the whole network of feelings that cannot be expressed so clearly, so sincerely. That might not be expressible directly, and you need indirection. Okay, irony is one form of indirection, but it's not the only one. And also, there are, you know, in terms of science, and in terms of political actuality, there are things that we just cannot know, that are not within the possibility of knowing for sure. So the idea that, you know, the role of fiction is to explore the real world, science gives us a much more complicated reality than that allows for, and it seems to me that that's the value of a Pynchon and a McElroy, is the science that they know, and it's not that they teach it like dogmatically, you know, but they do know and read deeply in the sciences. They read deeply in history, and give you the, you know, indirectly a sense of those realities, and their work is informed by them. If you look at the uncertainty principle in science, when you know, if you have a condition, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is light a particle or a wave. By making a measurement, you affect that reality. Okay, it's not a reality that's out there waiting to be found. The human presence changes.
Like reader, you change.
It's great together.
Yeah, you co-author.
The reader is not a consumer that you can calculate what will give pleasure and what will not. The reader is a mind like yours and cannot read your mind, and you cannot read the reader's mind. Unless you're doing something else, which is monitoring their consumer behavior. That you can read. But you cannot read the reader's mind reading you. That's an act of imagination. Okay? And that kind of co-presencing, that kind of cognitive network is more interesting to me and more realistic than traditional realism. So I think that the movements toward a more realistic and self-centered aesthetic is a regression. Okay, and it loses the progressive possibilities within the kind of postmodern tradition that we're talking about.
I want to ask, Bogdan, remember it, when Joseph McElroy was in Kiev, we asked him why does he think that his works are postmodern one, and he disagreed with this statement. He totally disagreed with. He said, "I am a late modernist. I am not a postmodernist." So my question will be, why do these postmodern writers, as we call them, postmodern writers, why do they afraid? Why are they afraid of this title? Maybe it's some I don't know, some essential difference between modernism and postmodernism. What is the main difference for you, as you see it?
Well, postmodernism, for one thing, it means it has a discourse if you're in architecture, and it has a very different discourse if you're in literary theory, let alone literature. Jameson, who took the architectural ideas and brought them into literary theory, didn't say a whole lot about authors like Thomas Pynchon and Joseph McElroy, which was good for me. I remember I took a seminar with Jameson. He visited University of Toronto one summer, and I sat in on his seminar, learned a lot. But the main thing I learned was that the authors I'm writing about, Thomas Pynchon and the others, Jameson's not. I've got something to do. Okay, but my point is that these are all different fields that don't really talk to each other, and that's one problem with the postmodern label. At the same time, there's not such a problem with the modern label. You know, who do you know? Who do you know that's not modern? What would you do if you decided, I'm not modern? Go fishing?
Stop thinking.
Oh, no. You could think in a pre-modern way, but could you go and live by the lake? In Ukraine, more so, slightly.
Like Walden.
Yeah, but even when Thoreau went to Walden, you know, once a week he could go and have dinner with the family or with Emerson, and it was Emerson's largesse that allowed him to spend that time. Also, Thoreau once went to deep nature and reported back how every part he saw in that deep nature, this is the late 19th century, had already been touched. You know, whether it's trash left by another visitor or simply, even though there weren't any people around, there were regularly people visiting and going there, and the signs were there. So you cannot reproduce a pre-modern life world. And that's why I think the modern designation is less controversial.
Oh, of course.
And in fact, I'm just repeating in my own mode, I'm reiterating Lyotard's position, which is that postmodernism is when
Condition.
it's once it's modern, then you're in the post already.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jameson too said postmodernism is simply when there's no alternative to the modern, when the modern has been realized. Okay, and then I think the term is meaningful. But at the same time, once you've gone there to the Jameson-Lyotard position, you are. You don't need the term, and maybe we should simply talk about like all of it as one continuing dialogue about the modern, within the modern. I think that I'd be happy with that.
So we can say that every big project appears to be an open project. It's like modern is an open project, and postmodern is also open project inside another open project. It's very complicated. A lot of modernism and a lot of postmodernism, like fractal project. It can frighten people. I would like to ask you about female postmodern tradition, because female postmodern writers are not very widely known. Is there any tradition like female tradition, and if it is, how does it differ from male one?
Ursula Le Guin, Lynn Tillman. These are authors that are doing this, have the same kind of range that I spoke of when I spoke about the integration of science into the imagination. And it's also with Le Guin, she, like William Gibson after, and like Joseph McElroy, doing Plus, reimagines the science fiction mode. Again, science fiction was established as a genre. What Le Guin does with that in Always Coming Home is doesn't simply do another really cool science fiction book, but reimagines the genre for a current situation. McElroy reimagines the genre by actually it's a science fiction notion. You take a brain and you put it into orbit, and it grows around it a biosphere, a small biosphere within the capsule. But the difference with McElroy is he sees. He tells the story from the perspective of the brain, or at least gives you enough of that to imagine that that's what you're listening to, and that's something other than just working in the science fiction mode. Lynn Tillman looks at one other questionable part of these authors, and implicit in the largeness of Gravity's Rainbow and McElroy's Lookout Cartridge, Don DeLillo's Underworld, and less so Libra. That's more of an historical fiction.
White Noise.
But White Noise. Like these authors all are moving towards a transcendence and a greatness. There's some kind of implicit challenge, attempt to meet the challenge of writing the great American novel. And Tillman addresses this directly in her book called American Genius. But the genius that Tillman imagines is not extensive by terms of range only. It's just one person at in a community of, what is it? Is there some kind of, are they all suffering from some mental disorder? Or is it a writer's camp? He never says what the place is, but many of the people in this place are overly sensitive. and there's an extensive sensitivity, and the main character is literally, her skin is sensitive, and she needs to have this cured because her skin is overly sensitive. But what that approach gives her, like the McElroy brain, is a way of exploring sensitivity beyond the individual identity. Sensitivity, which by the way is the way cognition works. The brain, what we cognize is much larger than what we're conscious of. Consciousness is a very small part of cognition, and most of cognition is sensual. The fact that we're all sitting, we don't think about this, but there's as much of our mental capacity is keeping us in place, seated, as it is talking about American literature. So recognizing how large an aspect of our sensitivity and sensibility, how much of that makes up our reality. I guess Tillman is in sync with a lot of affect theory, which is a term that theorists come up with this. But what it's doing is showing how the networks and the informational patterns around us are much larger than what we can know. It's not the same as paranoia, but it's this. Because it doesn't have all of the conspiracy theory and all of that. But what it does have, and this is the part of the paranoia I want to hold on to, is a recognition that there are things larger than us that we cannot know, and that these things are, as McElroy says in an interview, beckoning us outside ourselves. So that's why I think Le Guin and Tillman are the two women writers I can think of that share this ambition with the mainstream postmodern American writers.
The next question is maybe a bit connected with the previous one about women tradition. Understand this interesting mixture of sensuality and science, and something's being held but without this paranoia trauma. I would also ask you about the tradition of some postmodern school tradition, because, for example, Melville has his own tradition of people who are trying to write like Melville, like a big this American novel. Also, for example, some realistic authors like Dickens has also some school of Dickens writing like Dickens. And does this American tradition, postmodern tradition, and the separate authors, do they have their own schools? Like some people who are trying to write in, for example, Pynchon way or McElroy's way.
Wallace.
And Wallace way. Yeah.
We talked about Wallace.
Yeah. The best answer I heard from that, I heard from one of the major postmodern authors and a close friend. Well, not close friend, I don't see him that often, but a friend, Robert Coover. This was years ago in a conference in Germany, or I'm sorry, in Poland. And he said that when the postmodern thing was going on, like Coover knew about Pynchon and and Gaddis, and they all knew about DeLillo, and everyone knew what was going on, but they didn't really think of what they're doing as part of a genre. What they thought they were doing is something different from modernist literature. They weren't doing James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. That's Coover's take on it, and I like that because in the first place it shows as a continuing dialogue with Joyce and Woolf, but at the same time they know they can't just repeat it. Now that's, I think, a correct depiction of what it felt like to be making the work at that time. And again, I cite Coover because he was making it. He wasn't just theorizing it as I am. Let's not say just theorizing it. Let's delete that just. He's not reflecting on it in a scholarly mode. He's there making it. A couple of decades before I came on the scene, what that implies is that there's already a problem with genre formation. You don't want to write another Joyce Ulysses. First you know that you're not going to, and you don't really want to write another Moby Dick. Arguably, the rocket in Gravity's Rainbow has a similar function to the whale in Melville's novel, but I don't have the feeling that Pynchon is self-consciously trying to rework Melville in the way that Joyce is self-consciously reworking Homer. Yeah. So there's a problem with genre when it comes to the experimental vein. There's not a problem with genre when it comes to Dickens or Austen, or Jane Austen. In fact, and that's one reason why we're still reproducing 19th century realism in a time that has very little in common with that particular set of circumstances in Britain, in Great Britain at a certain period. That's made for generic reproduction. And the kinds of writing that interests me, that is less in tune with personal self-expression, less in tune with, talking about a trajectory from beginning, middle to end, a narrative trajectory that allows the individual and the family to get settled in this complex modern world. That's all what genre fiction does. Looking beyond just, how do, we have a family life, or if family is reconceived, how do we have a post-family life, a multiply gendered life within the world that we find ourselves, this modern world. Okay, there are other ways of looking at the complexity of that modern world itself, and the unknowability of it. Okay, which hasn't found generic form, and it might be. I'm actually just thinking of this for the first time. It might not be possible, and that's probably the reason why you don't have a second generation after the Pynchon, Gaddis, DeLillo generation turning up, with one exception. You want to reform that question about David Foster Wallace?
Yeah, I want to ask about we talked today earlier about David Foster Wallace, prominent figure and tragic figure in American literature, and you said that he was a prominent figure, but he didn't leave a generation after him. He was, maybe in some sense, he was last postmodernism, or the last big figure in the 20th century's postmodernism, and now we have postmodernism or something else more cruel or thing. So what do you think about David Foster Wallace school? Because so many writers mention about his works, about his influence. Do they David Foster Wallace children's, and do you think about it?
Yeah, I don't think that there will or can be a David Foster Wallace school.
Yeah.
And his work seems, literally sui generis. And earlier today, when over lunch, we found this one passage early in Wallace, which shows a disposition early on that is clearly counter to the tradition of postmodern experimentalists like Joseph McElroy and Donald Barthelme, who are actually mentioned a page before.
Yeah.
So Wallace's character in this is from Girl with Curious Hair
Collection.
Collection of stories. the character Mark Nectar, who's thinking about these postmodernists. Please don't tell anybody. This is Wallace. Please don't tell anybody, but Mark Nectar desires some distant, hard-earned day to write something that stabs you in the heart. So unlike the postmodern predecessors, Wallace is imagining, something that stabs you in the heart. And here, but I cite this one because it's such a clear celebration of sincerity. Comes straight from the heart. And I cite this because it's so clearly impossible and wrong. I'd like to say what's wrong with that, but I'd like to actually get a quotation from Wittgenstein and from Donald Davidson that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. And I think it's better if I actually read out the citation, because then it's just not my disposition as a literary critic of why there's a problem with sincerity, but it really is philosophically problematic, and I think Wallace came to know this. In Wallace's late work, he doesn't have so many flat statements like this, but at the same time, statements like this are that's where the influence was most, because writers Wallace's age and younger could say, okay, now I can go back to being straight and sincere. I don't need all of that postmodernist irony. Okay. So in the handout that I'm going to circulate tomorrow for the lecture, I have a citation from Donald Davidson, Communication and Convention. My annotation on Davidson goes like this: the generation of writers after Thomas Pynchon may have strived for a return to untrendy human values, such as sincerity, and felt unironic emotion, straight from the heart, right? Yeah. Yet the absence of any formal or stylistic convention for sincerity on the part of an author or literary characters limits the concept's usefulness as a generic or narratological foundation. It is clear, writes Davidson, that there cannot be a conventional sign that shows that one is saying what one believes. For every liar would use it. Convention cannot connect what may always be secret, the intention to say what is true, with what must be public, making an assertion. There is no convention for sincerity. Okay, that's the problem with the new sincerity. Yeah. That's the problem with the realistic formation of genre. Is that the minute you say I'm being sincere, it's over. Okay. The alternative is you know that someone's sincere when you trust someone. Yeah. That is something that cannot and must not be articulated. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's different if I say sign this paper and it shows that I trust you. Then it becomes an economic relationship, not a conceptual one, not a cognitive one, and certainly not an aesthetic one. Okay, the minute you sign it, then it's a different order. Okay, and that's a confusion that is systemic to our age, not just to literature. The idea that it has to be signed in paper and it has to be clear and better if it's expressible in numeric terms. Okay, I do some work in digital literature too, and one thing I tell students there about electronic literature and the digital, there's always an infinity between 0 and 1. And that infinity is the place where the imagination inhabits.
A lot of infinity jests.
Infinite, yes, yeah. And it's not, but so often the infinite jest is just an infinite number of choices that can be articulated, and maybe not infinite, but maybe the millions, billions, trillions that can be now stored and could not be before, because we have the digital machines to do them, to do that storage. But So what? There's a billion data. There's data with a billion. Once you've named it as a billion, that's just one more piece of data. Now, what do you do with it? How do you conceptualize it? How do you think about it? Okay. Wittgenstein does give us some indication there. And if you hold this for a second, it shouldn't take me long to find the Wittgenstein.
There it is.
Yeah. I've been saying that, there's no convention for sincerity, that you need to have trust. That means you're in the realm of aesthetics, but it also means you're in the realm of ethics. Yeah. And I hadn't realized how, connected they were until I just happened to be reading this essay that was written recently by Ralph Berry, a very accomplished novelist and a Wittgenstein philosopher. And this is going to be published in my journal, Electronic Book Review. So he has two citations, Ralph Berry has two citations from Wittgenstein, Tractatus. This one says, "It is clear that ethics cannot be put into words. Ethics is transcendental." And then in parentheses, and of course, if Wittgenstein's put something in parentheses, or if he doesn't say it, that's what he really is getting at, right? We know that about Wittgenstein. Ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. So again, sincerity, that's where, if I'm sincere, you believe me. And it's a paradox. But it can only be enacted if it's not spoken directly. And that's what the value of aesthetics is, philosophically, for Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein also touches on this question of infinity. And one thing is, we all know that we're not going to live forever. So it's, in a way, I think there's something good about our, fascination with big data, because that's like something that extends forever. But again, once it's, Nick Montfort, who is a maker of digital fiction, said it best in a electronic literature conference. I'll never forget this. He just said, "Big data is not big." Once you name trillion,
not enough.
There you have it. It's just 1 point, trillion, or you can call it gazillion. It doesn't. It's not big. So again, I think there's an honest desire for something larger than the self, but that's not the way to get it. Through the digitized element alone, and. But where is this immortality, this unspoken truth? Well, God is one way of talking about it, and that's why God is somebody we meet after death. The problem with that is that this is not an event that can be represented. Well, it can be represented, but not. But I can represent others' deaths. I can't represent my own. Okay, so this is another kind of no convention for argument that Wittgenstein is making in this quotation. Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. Again, my death can be narrated by others who know me, but I cannot experience that as an event. If we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, you live forever, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. Paradox, anybody, again?
Yeah.
Our life has no end in just the way in which our visual field has no limits. Now that thing, the visual field,
issue of vision, somehow. I think his mentioning of life and death, it's just a vision, different vision. For us, maybe for us it's life, for someone it's death. It's a issue of vision. And it's for me what you said. Postmodernism is there are a lot of postmodernisms and modernism. It depends on person's vision. I see that this is modernism. I see that this is postmodernism. It's another issue of vision, my view on this problem, as I see.
I think you too. I think that all categories are doubtful. They are doubtful by their nature, and it sounds a bit of Lacanian. So when you put the word into words, the problem appears.
Yeah. And that's completely consistent with everything in McElroy's Plus and everything in Wittgenstein's thought, as well as Davidson. So, one conclusion is, so then why read? Because it's all words. Except that what makes it literature is those words stimulate thought, and we imagine ourselves into the mind of the author during the author's writing, and maybe imagine things that we ourselves can write. That's where the literary happens. The literary doesn't happen in the words on the page.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's a necessary paradox that you ground literary knowledge in. It's not only about literature. If you go to systems theory generally, it's the theory I'm thinking of is more Niklas Luhmann. It's grounded in paradox, in the sense that a system can only know what it knows. A system cannot know the environment. If it knows the environment, then it only knows it in the terms that the system is able to know it. So, if I try to come up with an example that's relevant. The way systems work, and this is very much an American model that Luhmann had in mind, because in America there were not so many religious-based, there was a separation of church and state as a foundational move. That's a way of saying, okay, let the church deal with all this foundationless belief system, and let the state deal with what can be measured, etc. Okay, that's an important step towards modernity. That's a way. That's one that's in many ways not so much the literary way, but I think in the social and political way, that's a very good way, the system's way to think about modernity, the separation of church and state. Okay, now, but that separation becomes many functional differentiations. If you want to study literature, you do that. If you want to study philosophy, you do this, and you don't confuse the two. And I would say the fact that Wallace, Pynchon, and McElroy do confuse those two, that makes them great. Yeah. Okay, because that then in a way they're going against this specific tendency of modernism to functionally differentiate. Yeah. If like law functions as law. The distinction there that's important is it legal or is it illegal? Whereas religion functions as religion. Is it, do you believe in it or do you not believe in it? It's a different fundamental distinction. Okay, but none of these distinctions can be grounded in a reality out there. It's all based on, just professional and communicational activity. Okay, it's not based on something outside of that. And if another way of characterizing the books we're talking about, and this was done by Tom LeClaire early on in the 1980s. The way to understand the value of these writers in particular is that they are engaging with science, and they're bringing the uncertainties in science into contact with the uncertainties of language. They're not saying that they're absolutely separate, which is a more conservative way of dealing with this. They're actually trying through words to get the same kinds of foundationlessness, the same grounding in paradox that you find in the sciences, and also, you know, the fact that there's so much that determines us biologically and cognitively that we cannot know, that we don't know consciously, you know, and making that part of their aesthetic. It's a unique and I think appropriate realism for our time, but it's very different from conventional realism. Yeah, there's irony, but there's irony in the sense of like the paradox of the liar's paradox. Okay, you know, I can tell you everybody from Chicago is a liar.
I'm from Chicago.
As you know, so you know that, right? Yeah, okay. So that's you know, that recognition of paradox. Yeah. But you know, it's the point of these paradoxes is that they're all over the place and you can't get around them. This is what the logical positivists tried to get around, and the logical positivists, the Whiteheads and Bertrand and Russells. Not Bertrand, you know, yeah, Bertrand Russells. They say, okay, let's put words over here and let's do the meaningful stuff over here, which is, you know, actually quite valuable for building, you know, like active knowledge, but it's not valuable for ethics and aesthetics. Okay, and living within that paradox is what the aesthetics should be about. I think that these writers that we have an interest in, that you're translating, and also the bringing in of a generation of feminist and women writers needs this approach to do more than reiterate past genres.